Hi, welcome to the CEO podcast. Today we have Bethany Corbin. She's the CEO and co-founder of Fem Innovation. She's also an attorney. Welcome to the show. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Thank you so much for having me, Brittany. I'm so excited to be here. Yeah, so as you mentioned, I am the co-founder and CEO of Fem Innovation, which is focused on uniting the entire women's health ecosystem together under one roof to really help propel clinically meaningful devices and inventions in the women's health care system. So that's really what we're focused on. I'm also an attorney, as you mentioned. I have the first law firm in the US that operates exclusively for the benefit of women's health innovators. So that is a lot of what I do in my spare time is working to help get women's healthcare products to the market and get them to the market faster.
Amazing. Give me a couple examples of a women's healthcare product, just for those listening.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. What we work on falls within the realm of FemTech, which a lot of people have never heard of before. It really stands for female health technology. So basically, we're talking about anything that is women's health oriented that has a digital health component. So these are going to be things like your period tracking apps, your fertility apps. But we're also starting to see new headways being made into things like menopause. So telehealth menopause clinics are coming online. We're also starting to see Ember, which is one of those wearable devices you can use for hot flashes. Some of the names that people are probably really familiar with in this space are things like Clue, Glow, Flow, Thinx, Kindbody, and Maven. Those are kind of the top ones people usually know.
Yeah, I use Flow.
Yeah.
so I know. Awesome. Okay. So when we spoke originally, for those listening, I always do kind of a screening call before we have guests on the podcast. We had discussed how you basically moved into this space and how you transformed yourself within a year. And that's what I thought that listeners would really find interesting. So tell us a little bit about your background and how you ended up here, and then we'll dive into a little more of like the details.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's interesting, right? My career has had a lot of pivots in it. So for instance, it may surprise a lot of people to know, but FemTech was not even coined when I went to law school. So this wasn't even an industry that I could have gotten into right out of law school. And so for me, I actually started my journey as a lawyer doing financial services and litigation work, and I absolutely hated it. It was mind-numbingly boring to me, not something that I felt very fulfilled doing. And so for me, it really took a lot of time to figure out, okay, what am I passionate about? What do I want to be doing? I then moved into healthcare in general, doing healthcare law, more at a very large law firm at Washington, D.C. And a lot of what I did there was more focused on managed care, PBM work, insurance type work for larger healthcare system. Interestingly, I thought I got my dream job. I went to become a law professor and I loved what I was doing, but that was the first time, it was around 2018, that I came across the term FemTech. And I started diving into it. I came across it in some totally unrelated scholarship research I was doing. And I thought, this is really interesting and nobody is talking about it, especially in the legal field. So I did the unthinkable for many people. I left academia. I went back into the practice of law. And it was really to explore how I might help those women's health founders come to the market faster.
Okay.
And interestingly, I got kind of caught back up in the big law world of working with larger corporations. And that dream kind of fell to the side for a little bit. And then at that point, I had a very unexpected women's health issue of my own. And it really forced me to navigate the healthcare system as a patient and to realize how little interventions had been, redefined and brought to the market in the last 30 plus years. And that for me was kind of the light bulb moment of saying, I need to focus on FemTech 100% of my time, and having to redefine myself in that role as somebody who came into it with no experience in FemTech whatsoever.
I love that. I like that you had a pivotal moment where you noticed a gap in the market, and that's kind of where you went, because I think that is one of the most used pieces of advice when for entrepreneurs is find your gap in the market, find your niche. And it's hard to kind of for people when they hear that to understand exactly kind of what it means or how to apply it. And they're like, well, how do I know there is a gap? So by doing something where you find a personal gap or something you've gone through and experienced, I think just lends so much more authenticity to what you are backing and what you're doing. So tell us more about that year where you had to like jump right in and learn all about it. And what were those really important milestones that you had to hit?
Yeah. So whenever I was jumping into FemTech, I had zero connections in this industry at all, right? The only people I knew were other lawyers in other large law firms because that had been my entire world. And so I also knew very little about the startup world, which is a whole world in and of itself, right? And so I had to make a big leap. I had transitioned. I was kind of next in line for partner at my firm. And I decided what I really wanted to do was to focus on that digital health aspect. So my first step was to move to a job that that actually would get me experience with that type of work. So I left big law. I went to a small law firm that focused exclusively on digital health and healthcare innovation. I remember very distinctly my first week at that firm crying for about almost every day because I realized I had no idea what I was doing. And right, as somebody who's been a lawyer, right, for 5, 6, 7 years at that point in time, to be doing law and realize you have no idea what you're doing in the startup world for these companies was absolutely terrifying. I thought I had made a huge mistake. I stuck with it. I learned a ton. I really started to feel connected with the founders I was working with, obviously expanded my own knowledge base. And then I said, okay, I've got under my feet, what I'm working on. I really want to do this for the FemTech niche that's out there right now. And so what I did is I started asking around anywhere that I could find about the word FemTech, anyone who at all had it in their LinkedIn profile. I Googled FemTech, right, just to see who those key actors were in this space that I needed to be following. So my first year was within that first year, I would say the first 2 to 3 months was solely focused on information gathering. Who should I be following? What are the organizations that are discussing this? What are the events that are out there where I can learn more about this and help find what those gap areas are? So I started reaching out to people on LinkedIn, asking if they would have 5 to 10 minutes just to meet with me so I could understand better what they were doing in this space. I started attending virtual events because, of course, this was the height of COVID. And so I would hop on, and it amazed me how many people were introducing themselves or adding their LinkedIn profiles in the chat. And that was a great way for me to start connecting and expanding my audience. And then I read every single piece of news about FemTech that I could get my hands on during that time as well. Because part of me, whenever I came into that field, right, I knew there were gaps, but I didn't know 100% what they were. And I didn't want to assume that I knew what they were. So for me, it was a lot of information gathering that first 2 to 3 month period. Then I actually started to join some of those organizations over the next 2 months. Once I figured out which ones were there, which ones aligned with what I was doing and who I was trying to serve, I started joining them. So I picked about 3 organizations because I didn't want to overwhelm myself, but I did want to have a nice variety. I picked 3 and I started to continue to network with the members in that industry. After that, I started to reach out and say, this is great. I want to be more involved, right? So by then we're kind of at the 4 to 6 month period. And I said, I want to be more involved. How do I do this, right? What can I be doing that's going to give back to your members in a way that's valuable? So I actually started to become a mentor in a couple of different organizations for startup companies, different accelerator and incubator programs. And that allowed me to continue to work with founders on a pro bono basis and continue to learn about their needs and what they were experiencing and where their gap areas were. And then after that, it was about the 6 month, 7 month time mark, people started to know my name. And at that point in time, I had been posting on LinkedIn. I didn't have, a lot of new material to say, but I would post articles that I had found in FemTech. And I would use, the different hashtags that were relevant to that industry. And I made sure to post about 2 to 3 times a week. And I was just commenting on news articles that I saw in the industry. And that started to tell people that I was serious about this industry, about moving into this field, and people started to recognize my name a little bit more. And then once that happened, people started reaching out to me to say, hey, we're having a webinar. Do you want to be part of this? We know you're interested in FemTech. We'd love to hear your legal perspective. And so I started to get my first 2 or 3 webinar opportunities in that space. That was about month 8 at that time frame. And once that happened, I was able to really propel myself out as an expert in FemTech because I was doing the public speaking. People had started to know my name. People knew that I was posting credibly on the social media site. And at that point in time, I was able to also start going back to some of the in-person conferences that had come up, and we're moving out of COVID phase by then. And so I was able to go to in-person conferences and make those one-on-one connections. And from there was able to really transform what I was posting and what I was writing about into a thought leadership piece where I was actually giving my own opinion from my own background. And then I started getting opportunities to post those pieces in Entrepreneur and MedCity News and different outlets out there. And that was really kind of what propelled me into the thought leadership space within that 1-year time frame.
Wow. I like how you have a very step-by-step process. And I think it's applicable to anyone who is looking to excel or position themselves as an expert in their niche. You went through the market research phase, the info gathering phase, networking, and then starting to get more involved. You took like all these really reasonable steps that people could follow in order to get to where you're going. What would you say is your largest impact that you've had to date for the space that you're in?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think the largest impact that I've been able to have is providing resources for early stage founders in the women's health space, because that was one of the gap areas that I was able to identify, not only working at a smaller law firm and working one-on-one with these companies, but also doing the mentorship that I was doing with accelerator programs and being on these different webinars and calls and just listening. There was a dearth of resources for early stage founders. And what we would often see is founders wouldn't have a ton of money. They'd ask for assistance, they'd get turned away because of their funding status. And then they'd come back a year or two later and people would say, great, but here's 10 things you did wrong in the interim. And now it's going to cost you 2 or 3 times more. And that to me just seemed heartbreaking, right? Because we've got a ton of female founders in this industry, all of whom had great ideas, and yet they weren't being able to access the resources they need. So we actually were dedicated to that at Fem Innovation and created a resource hub and an innovation hub where founders could come and really get the resources that they need and the guidance they need at that early stage. So I would say that's been, just one of the greatest accomplishments that I've been most proud of during my time here.
Yeah. Okay. So you basically provide to new coming founders things to help them grow their business and to not get kind of sidetracked into different paths where they're going to, hit detriment in what they're trying to build.
Yeah, that's been a key part of our platform, is really making sure that we have expertly created guides and document bundles that these founders can access at a fraction of the cost of what they would, otherwise be charged at a law firm, right? Or with a business consultant. And that way they can make sure that they're understanding the landscape and the key risk areas, because you don't know what you don't know. And that way, as they're continuing to build up and fundraise, they're not making those crucial mistakes that could actually put their companies in risk going forward.
Okay. Can you give me a real life example of that? So if somebody is starting an app or whatever type of digital technology they're using, how would they fall into, like, what pitfalls would they experience that they might want to avoid?
Yeah, there's quite a few, and a couple come to mind. The first is on the corporate structure, right? Your corporate formation. So a lot of times our founders don't realize, the differences between LLCs or C Corps and which one they need to have and where they need to form it if they're looking to attract venture capital money in the future. So I've had several clients who have come to me and they may have set up an LLC in, Minnesota, right, or Alabama, and they're looking for venture capital funding. And most of the time they don't realize that venture capitalists are going to want you to have a C Corps that's formed in Delaware. And so that's one of the areas, right, where it's going to cost you more money to make that conversion or to shut down your LLC and then reform in Delaware. Another example that happened pretty recently, and this is, a much greater risk, but it has to do with fundraising. So I had a client who was very interested in trying to use what's called a finder to go out and find venture capital money or angel investor money for them in exchange for a percentage of the money that comes in. And my client, right, they thought it was a great idea, right? They were very excited about that. But the problem is that securities laws actually prevent that type of arrangement unless that person is registered as a broker dealer. And so that was one thing where I was able to say, ask him if he's a broker dealer, right? And if he's not, we cannot structure the arrangement like this. And so that actually saved them from having to, enter into a contract with him. And any money that he brought in under that contract could have been rescinded by the venture capitals, the venture capital funds. It could have had longer term fines imposed on it, would have had to be disclosed to future investors. And all of that would have had a really chilling impact on future investment in the company and the longevity of the company. So those are sort of a couple of different examples. And we have guides on all of those for our founders on our platform as well, so that if that's something they are considering, they can at least read that guide, see where those key risk areas are, and know what questions to ask.
I think that's fantastic because, I'm totally not in that space, but, you have all these ideas. And as an entrepreneur, that's kind of our lifeblood, is new ideas and excitement and being kind of the visionary. And a lot of times those dreams or visions or big ideas are stopped in their tracks simply because of bureaucracy and because you don't actually know the path to take. So having that type of, especially because you saw a gap in the market and then now you provide this, I think it's so interesting to see kind of where you came from and then now what you're providing to others to actually bring all of these amazing ideas to fruition. Because I think that's really, I just actually hired a business coach for the exact same reason, because I have a lot of ideas, but I get kind of stuck when I'm like, how to implement or how to get from like where I am today to the big idea I have. It's like, I know it's possible, but I'm like, I need the steps and I need someone with a different brain than mine to like implement how that works. So I really love that, you're out there doing that. And I hope that people listening can get some inspiration from that in whatever field that they're in, to kind of, if they are an expert and they know the steps, like reach back, help those behind you you, help bring them up through, right? Another thing that you had kind of mentioned we could chat about today was the top legal mistakes for launching and scaling your company. So that's something I wanted to touch base on as well while I have you on the call here.
Yes, no, this is a fantastic topic because there are so many mistakes that founders make and CEOs make purely because they don't know, right? Or they're operating in an industry that maybe they haven't operated in before, and so they're not familiar with the laws and regulations in that industry. So there's a couple of kind of universal mistakes that I see that are made across industries. The first one is, and it's so simple, but picking your entity name, that's one where a lot of people get tripped up, and there's a couple reasons there. The first is a lot of people don't realize that whatever state that you're filing and forming your company in, they actually regulate what type of name you can use and what has to be in that name, right? So a lot of them are going to require an entity designation at the end, right? Like LLC or corporation. A lot of people don't realize that, and then they submit their filing and it gets rejected for that. You also can't have anything misleading in your name. So for instance, if you're providing a medical service, right, you can't say we are healthcareinsurance.com, right? Things like that would be misleading or for a purpose that you're not authorized to form for. But right, so that's kind of part A, right? The state requirements. But part B, where a lot of founders also get tripped up, is on the trademark requirements. So even if you're not thinking about trademarking your particular entity name, you could accidentally be infringing on somebody else's trademark name that's already been protected. And so a lot of founders don't do that initial trademark search to see if they're going to be infringing. And what I see happen, and this has happened to a couple of clients of mine, they've been in business for a couple of years, and then all of a sudden they get a cease and desist letter for using that name from the company that has it protected. And then you have to undergo a complete rebranding, changing that name, rebrand your entire products, right? Your company. That costs a lot of money, and it can also be confusing to consumers. So you have to find a way to also, make that kind of a publicity stunt so that you're able to say, okay, no, we're rebranding, right? Not because we've infringed on somebody's trademark, right? But because, right, XYZ different reasons. And that can cost you a lot of money in terms of publicity, marketing, as well as, the initial cost that you're going to have to rename everything, rebrand, repackage. So that's kind of one key area that we see. Another key area that we see is in the fundraising landscape as well. A lot of companies want to raise angel investment or venture capital funds, but obviously securities laws, a lot of founders are not familiar with, and they're very complex. One of the things that we see as a key area of risk is a lot of founders just don't know the difference between accredited and unaccredited investors, and why they have to, why they should have accredited investors. So accredited investor is a term, right, under the SEC, and it's really talking about which types of investors meet a certain monetary threshold to be able to invest in your company and fall under an exception in the securities laws. So you want to make sure if you are accepting, angel investments or things like that, especially from friends and family, that they're falling within that definition of accredited investor. Otherwise, if you're taking their money, you may not fall within a securities exception. You could have substantially more notification requirements, disclosure requirements, and a lot of times founders don't recognize that. So I would say that's another area. And then kind of the third area that we see a lot of has to do with data privacy. So how you're going to use and collect and disclose consumer data. And we've really seen the Federal Trade Commission scrutinizing this, especially in healthcare, but also in other industries. A lot of founders, and I see this all the time, they think, okay, I've got my competitor here. They've got a privacy policy on their website. I'm just going to copy and paste and use their privacy policy, right? Or their terms of use. The problem with that is no matter how similar your companies are, how that company is using data is always going to be different than how your company uses data, because you're not an identical company or an identical product. And so because of that, if you're just copying and pasting from a competitor, you're already likely going to have some material omissions or things that aren't accurate in your privacy promises to consumers. And that's really what the Federal Trade Commission is looking at and going after companies for. So it's always worthwhile to invest in having an attorney create that for you, at least, that first draft, so that you've got something that's specific to your company and that you can rely on as you move forward. So those are kind of the top three that I see a lot.
Yeah, I think that last one is very applicable, because really you have to have that on your website. You see it all the time. You're like, oh, or you'll Google it and take one off the internet. And it's like, just to have it on the website, but you really should have your attorney look at it, because you don't want to get caught in a situation where you've actually violated your own terms and conditions because you didn't even really read them. And then
Exactly.
you're into a bit of some hot water there. So I think
Well,
that,
exactly.
yeah,
And it's interesting too, because a lot of times the companies getting in trouble, they're not doing this maliciously, right? They're not, trying to deceive consumers in how they use data. But there's oftentimes, as you mentioned, right, people aren't reading it. The founders don't really understand what it means, or there's a mismatch between what their tech consultants are doing and what the founder thinks they're doing and what that actual product is or isn't using data for. And so oftentimes it's a miscommunication, right? Or you didn't read or you didn't understand. But then, right, the negative publicity that comes with an FTC investigation, the fines, the compliance requirements that could get imposed on you, all of that is something you don't want to have happen. So because of that, yeah, absolutely recommend having your lawyers review that or help you create it, at least that first version.
Amazing. Okay. The last kind of piece I wanted to touch on with you was another point you brought to the table, but the part about how to harness your fear and become a powerful leader, because I think that that is probably something people run into. I mean, I just mentioned earlier, we don't even know the steps to go through, but in addition to that, we also probably have a lot of fear based on our idea and how we want to actually get to it and what's going to happen if it actually comes true and all of these things. So, can you talk about that a little bit as well?
Yes, I really can. So I mentioned that one of the things that really propelled me into the femtech industry was my own personal health issue that I had very unexpectedly. So during a routine physical exam, I actually got diagnosed with fibroids, which up to 80% of women will have. But mine were so huge that I was actually the equivalent of 6 months pregnant.
Wow.
And and they were crushing my organs. So that was very jarring, for somebody who, wasn't experiencing a ton of symptoms to have, be diagnosed with a pelvic mass. So that really thrust me into all of the research that I had to do as a patient, learning about the options, right? And really my only option was surgery because of their size and really trying to dig into what the risks were, right? And the surgery I ended up having is one of the top 10 most painful surgeries. It's, I was under anesthesia for 7+ hours with this. And for me, I had a lot of fear surrounding that entire diagnosis, investigation phase of what are my options, meeting with clinicians, getting all of the MRIs and the testing done. All of that was so scary to me as somebody who, I hadn't, really had any other medical experiences since I was maybe 10. And so for me, that fear was really paralyzing. And really was trying to figure out, okay, well, how do I keep pushing forward, right? What do I need to be doing in order to not be thinking about this 24/7 and worried about what comes next and what happens after, this procedure or this test? And so I had a significant amount of fear. And I really figured I had to step back and I had to say, what is this fear trying to tell me? What is it trying to teach me? Because we have fear for a reason, right? I mean, obviously there's the evolutionary reason, but I firmly believe that we also have fear because it can propel us forward and it can help us to accomplish something that we might not otherwise think we're capable of accomplishing. So for me, I really had to take time, and it took me about 6 or 7 months to think through, what is this experience trying to teach me? What is my fear showing me? And what do I need to do after this experience to make it worthwhile? Because clearly this was telling me something, right? Whether it was, that I was too stressed out at work and wasn't taking care of my body versus, maybe this just isn't going to be something that is helpful for me going forward, right? All of these different things had been crossing my mind. And as I mentioned, kind of prior to this, I had those small experiences with FemTech and was interested in FemTech, but had kind of moved away from it. And so I used this experience, and really after the surgery, I kept thinking, okay, how is this going to transform my life? Because I don't think this was just a one-off incident. I think this really was an inflection point for me for deciding what I wanted to do with my future. And I decided, I think that this is telling me I have to move into women's healthcare. This experience, right, was very unique and personal to me. And I have something that I can offer to help make sure that maybe in the future we have better fibroid treatments that don't require 7-hour surgeries. And so that was the inflection point for me. What I had to do after that, once I kind of made that decision, was I had to grapple then with the fear that I was going to be leaving a job that paid me 6 figures, very nice, comfortable life, into a job that I was going to make half the money with. And it could not work out, right? Maybe femtech really, fizzled and died. Who knows? And so that for me was the next fearful leap that I had to dive into. And what I had to do is I had to put my ego aside and I had to say, okay, I'm taking the ego out of it, right? Yes, I could have been partner, but that's not where my path has led me right now. What do I need to do? I need to make this step. Will I be financially able to afford it if this all goes wrong? Yes. And I was able to say, you know what? I'll get new skills anyway. I'm going to learn something new. So even if it all goes goes terribly wrong, I can still take that experience and work my way back to something. So that was kind of the second area of fear that I had to push through. And whenever I got there, I write to the smaller firm, as I mentioned, I thought I'd made a huge mistake. I was crying. I felt like I didn't know how to do anything, but I stuck with it. And now I am, one of the key voices in FemTech, in an industry, right, that I knew nothing about originally. So I would say, really what I learned from that experience and how others can use this is if you have a life-changing experience, right, or you're undergoing some type of, medical concern, right, or you're not happy with your life or something piques your interest, take a step back and say, what is this trying to tell me, right? Yes, it's going to be scary. What if it works out? What if it doesn't? But think about what your life could look like 1 year or 2 years down the road if you did it, if you stuck with it, and if you gave that 100%. And if you like what that outcome looks like, go for it, because you have the power to make that happen. If you don't, you're going to wonder forever and ever and ever, what would have happened if you didn't do that? And, one of the things for me, right, that I always look back on is being a law professor. That I thought was my dream job at the time. You know what? It really wasn't. Once I got in there and there was all this, bureaucratic red tape and that type of stuff. And it was something where I was so glad I did that experience, right? I took that chance. I had that learning opportunity, because if I hadn't, I would have wondered every day of my life from now whether or not I should have been a law professor. So even if it doesn't work out, knowing that is so much better than wondering about it your entire life.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's one of the most key parts of ending up where we want to be, is trying things that don't work out, because it really gives you more clarity on where you're going and what you're doing. It's just, you almost have to go through it to understand, okay, yep, I tried that. I tasted it. I didn't like it. I'm moving on to the next. Because you're right, you'll think about it forever if you don't. And I think the bravery of having to give something up that's secure, and I think a lot of entrepreneurs face that, because many of us start our lives in a corporate world or working for someone else, which again gives us all of those things and those lessons and those tastes that we're like, yeah, no, not quite what I want. But you do typically, I don't think I've ever spoken to anyone who is like, oh, it was just so easy. I just walked right over from my 6-figure a year job and I just walked right over here and then I started making 6 figures again. It's like, no, like when, and I was the same. I left the same exact kind of, I was still in a similar industry, but I left a very well-paying management job and I started my own company. And for 2 years, like, couldn't pay myself. And it was like, it's a big drop, but you have to take that drop in order to be able to climb back up and actually, surpass where you were before. So I think embracing that fear is a really key component to actually having any type of success. And then also taking all of those tiny steps in the middle, which I loved kind of how clear that was. And then lastly, just I think the advice you gave on the very common legal mistakes is so key. I know when I was starting my business, having to go through like nuanced searches and ensuring that you're not infringing on anyone. I mean, I'm in Canada and a lot of listeners are Canadian as well, but it's very similar. Like, we have different provincial laws as to how you can incorporate and how you should structure your business based on what your end goal is. And it's very similar in terms, if you are looking for funding, you have to have a different structure than if you're doing more service based. So I think the advice there is definitely engage an attorney and a legal team prior to making those decisions. Because like you said, you don't want to have to go back and undo all of that work. It all, time is money. And so you might as well make an investment up front and ensure that you're setting yourself up for success and for where you want your business to be, and just save that time from the get-go.
Yeah, I can't tell you how many times I hear founders say, I don't have enough money to pay an attorney, right? I don't want to spend my money on an attorney. But if you reframe it and think about all of the ways in which attorneys can actually help save you money down the road by engaging us early, it's shocking. Even for instance, I hear so many times founders grab contract templates from their friends, right? Oftentimes those have been post-negotiated. And so you're actually, if you're using those, right, you're not getting something that could be beneficial and have the best terms for you. And so you could actually be negotiating against yourself by doing things like that. Whereas if you have an attorney create a contract template for you and your specific organization up front, you can mitigate that type of risk and get potentially better deals. That's just one example of ways in which that can save you some money and time and energy along the way too. So absolutely.
Yeah, I bootstrapped it from the beginning. And then a few years ago, went back and got the attorney and did all the things. And I wish I'd done it at the beginning. And like you said, yes, it's an investment, but you have to invest in your business for success. And that's like a non-negotiable like piece of advice that I would give people is just set it up correctly. It will save you money in the long run and it'll protect you. Like you have to have those things in place that are actually, I think what a lot of people don't realize is in our contracts, if you pull it off the internet or whatever it might not be for your proper jurisdiction. It might not be for your proper industry that you're in. And a lot of the stuff you can't actually put it in place. So if you have something in your contract that an attorney didn't actually review, you might not even be able to enforce it, which just makes it completely null and void. So by speaking to an attorney at the beginning, you're setting yourself up for being able to be safe, protected, and have all the pieces in place to actually build on a solid foundation. So I think that's a really important part to let everybody know. We're coming close to the end here. Do you have any last words of wisdom or advice for us?
The only thing I would add to what I've said so far is think big. And somebody had to tell me that, right? Because I talked about, kind of that first year and how I started getting up to like that thought leadership potential. Really in the second year is when I was able to propel that even to the next stage, but I wouldn't have done it on my own. I was talking to one of my mentors at that time and we were talking about my goals for the next year. And I said, you know what, I'd like to be on a couple webinars, maybe I actually get asked to speak at an in-person conference. And she looked at me and she said, no, make your goal bigger. You want to be a recognized thought leader in this space throughout the next year. Make that happen. And so I was like, wow, I think that's like really unattainable, right? Like I've only been in this industry for a year, but I said, okay, it's a challenge. Let me see what I can do with it. And I broke it down into steps, right? Started thinking, what does it take to be a thought leader? Well, it takes posting, right? It takes putting out content. I started a podcast that year because I wanted to start putting out more content. It takes, being involved in writing articles. So I need to write more articles. I set a goal for myself to write at least one article a month. I set a goal for myself to reach out to in-person conferences and just ask if there was any way that I could help them with my areas of expertise. And I could tell you during that year, I was quoted in some of the top publications out there, right? Cosmopolitan, Teen Vogue, Bustle, NPR, BBC, Forbes, Fortune. I was able to, testify on reproductive health data before a government agency, right? So those things happened not because of the smaller things that I had done, but because of the culmination of all the small steps that I made along the way and somebody telling me to think bigger. So for anyone out there who has small goals like I did, I would encourage you to think bigger and to make it that big, broad goal and then break it down into steps for how you can get there because you can achieve it. Sometimes you just need somebody to tell you that you can.
I love that. And thank you. Where can people find you if anyone listening is in FemTech or wants to look into your business? Where can they find you?
Yeah, so I'm very active on LinkedIn. You can find me linkedin.com/in/Bethany Corbin. You can learn more about Fem Innovation at feminnovation.com. On the FemTech side, I think there's actually a FemTech Canada organization that just launched last week as well.
Cool.
So that is really cool for any Canadian listeners out there. And then you're welcome to join our FemTech community as well. It's community.feminnovation.com.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much for all of that insight and amazing advice. And thank you for your time today. And I wish you all the best.
Thank you so much.